going to wait till halftime. I'm going to call it halftime. In between them, and we have the next 3 weeks do not have people signed up for food. And I know everyone sitting in this room has already brought food, but I'm going to go ahead and pass the list in halftime, because that's when everyone will be here, and we can make sure that everybody gets a chance. And like I said, if we don't have food one day, that's okay, right? Maybe. No, we'll be okay. We'll be okay. I know, right? We don't know what we would do if we couldn't eat in the morning. Okay, so do y'all wake up last night with those storms?
No.
Yeah, I know who the heavy sleepers are in the room. Or the people that have the easterly facing bedroom windows. I kind of woke up, it wasn't really bad,
It didn't seem bad.
but my husband's out of town, he's at that leadership thing, and so I was getting ready to lay down and I was watching the news, and they're all, make sure your flashlights are out, make sure this is out, and I'm like, where's John, keep it all? And he's got this neat little cabinet in our little safe room, which is our little half bath downstairs. And I go in there, he's got all the things. I was like, thank you, John. So, but I didn't need him, so that's good. I didn't need him. And then I was like, do I really need a flashlight if I've got a charged cell phone? Not really, but anyhow. So I'm glad we're all here this morning, and it wasn't raining horribly on our way in. So, anything that we need to pray for before we get started? Any burning prayer requests? Man, I haven't passed that prayer request folder in a long time. I should bring it back. But anything? Wow, y'all are easy today, huh? Cool. All right, let's go ahead and we will pray, and then we will get started with the fun, right? Dear God, thank you so much for rain that we needed, God. I know a lot of people are in the path of some pretty tough storms today, and I just pray for safety for them, that you would protect families and schools and children and just people in the path of that storm. We do thank you for the rain that we got last night, God. I know that in this room there are always needs that are represented, and we know that you know the deepest cries of our hearts. We know that you know the things that we are concerned about, that we are worried about, that we're confused about. And God, I just pray that you are at peace. Help us to just let those things fall away into your hands, if even just for the next couple hours while we study your word. God, we're looking at a passage of scripture that's difficult to talk about in 2022, and yet it's here for us, and we want to handle it in the correct way, God. I pray that you will lead us in truth, and let your grace and let your mercy always be the thing that reigns over us, because that is what your gospel is all about. We love you, and we thank you for this time. In your name we pray, amen. All right, so yes, marriage, divorce, remarriage, fun, right? Right. We all have our own stories coming into this room of those things, right? Your own experience with marriage, divorce, remarriage. I just want to stay right at the beginning. None of this is about shame or guilt. The gospel frees us from all of that, right? And so I don't even think that's what this chapter is about. But I do want you to know, as we move forward, and I was even thinking about it myself, is we all walk in this room with our own stories. The denominations we grew up in. For instance, I was thinking about the denomination I grew up in. It was called the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And I remember, I have this memory of sitting behind this family in church, and I really liked them in our church in Orlando. And I remember somehow finding out that the dad in the family, who was always a big helper in the church, could never serve as an elder in the church. And I remember being like, why can't he be an elder? Asking my parents. It was because he had been divorced. And I remember being like, yeah, well, in that denomination, that was back in the day, if you had ever been divorced, you were not allowed to serve on certain boards. I say that in 2022, and we're all probably sitting here going, what on earth? But that was the tradition I grew up in, and I know there's a lot that still hold to that, and that just brings a lot of shame, right? Brings a lot of guilt, it brings a lot of isolation to people. I mean, I didn't know his bigger story. He was remarried, and he had daughters, and was very active in church. But I was thinking about him today, like what would it have been like back there in 1987, attending a church where he knew there were certain things he couldn't do because he was divorced. I don't think that's what Paul's after in this chapter. And so as you and I step into it, we're going to do a really good job. That's why I really love doing this Bible study the way we do, is we're going to keep it in context the best we can. I did a little extra research. I was pulling out John's master's level. He has some books on Paul, and I was pulling them down, doing some research just because I want to make sure I handle it right and lead us in the right way as we talk about these things, because they do matter, but we want to make sure we handle it correctly. So let's move forward. Let's start out by, if you want, pull out page or turn to page 167 in your workbook, and it is that 1 Corinthians at a glance, right? And so you're glancing at 1 Corinthians 167. I got to get there myself. So let's talk about why Paul wrote this book. Why Paul wrote this book? This is always our review, isn't it? But why did he write it? He wrote it to a church he had an interest in, right? So why did he write it? They wrote to him, not to shame them, right?
Right.
To admonish them. I like that. I like that. Like Heather is. Did you write that down somewhere? Nice. That he's not writing to shame them. He's writing to admonish them. He's writing to bring them alongside him, correct some things, obviously. So that's why he wrote. So someone said something about a letter they had written to him, right? I think it was F.F. Bruce wrote one of the books that I was reading, and he writes a lot of commentaries, said one of our disadvantages of looking at a book like this and doing interpretation is we don't have that letter they wrote to him.
Right.
So we don't know what they said their problem was. We don't know what some of the theories or the thoughts were that were going on in the church. We can try to deduce some of those, but we don't have them. If we had that letter, it would help us, but we don't. So they had written him a letter. Okay, so he's answering questions that they had in that letter. Why else is he writing them? Not only had they written him a letter, he also heard about some situations. How did he hear about some situations? Someone talked to him, Chloe. Chloe did, right? I think she's a hero, but Chloe wrote to him, and so on your at a glance sheet, under major divisions, right? So we have all the chapter themes down here on the right, and then just look, it says major divisions. I think that's the major division, right? And we talked about that. Chapters 1 to 6, Paul is addressing problems he was informed about. Chloe, the informant. What were those two problems? What were those two problems? Immorality. What was the first one, Gina? I'm sorry. Just as you took them right? Quarreling. Yes. Quarreling. Divisions. Okay. So now you can fill in the first column that says problems or topics, right? So that first column that says problems or topics, the one that covers the first 4 chapters, is you can write quarreling or divisions in the church, because that's the problem that Chloe told him about. All right. Then the second one, this is verse 5, and this is chapters 5 and 6. What's the problem there? Someone said it, right? Immorality, right? I don't know where I got this. I got it from somewhere else maybe, but if you write immorality, you're not wrong. But somewhere I got and wrote down the church is not judging properly. Because they didn't judge the immorality properly, right? They hadn't made a correct decision about it. And also they were taking each other to court. So somewhere I read that a nice little thing for 5 and 6 is the church is not judging properly. Okay, so those are the problems he heard about. Divisions, quarreling, immorality, judging. Okay, now when you move down to chapters 7 to 16, and today we're starting with 7, what is this major division? Well, that's a problem. So I think in that first column, problems or topics, chapter 7 is marriage, right? And virgins, if you want to write that in there too. But that major division, what's going on in 7 to 16? Not the problems he's heard about, the problems that the church had written to him about. Okay. Yeah, Paul's response to what the church had written to him. Okay. So are we good on that there chart? That there chart? Okay, good. So today we're talking about marriage and virgins. Yay! Okay, so let us go into it. Let us hit it, right? Because that's the problem. Now, let's make sure we also start out with, let's look at 7, verse 1 and 2. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 7, and then we're going to take off running. It says, now concerning the things about which you wrote, that's that new segment division. Concerning the things that they wrote. Again, we don't have that letter. If we did, life would be easier, but we don't. So, then he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Verse 2 says, because of what word? Immoralities. So he's addressing immoralities again. He did it in chapter 5. And he's back on it in chapter 7. What does immorality mean? Here, we looked at it last week. Sexual immorality. It's that word for pornographer, porneia. Porneia, I think. So it's just general sexual immorality.
My Bible has that sentence, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, in quotes.
Okay.
Like that came out of the letter.
Let's talk about that, because your homework did not have you talk about it, but some of my research did, and I think it's a big miss. I think it's important. So as my mom said, so 7:1, I'm going to read it again. He says, now concerning the things about which you wrote. Mine has a comma, right? Okay, and then it says, then yours follows with quotation marks. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. What version are you looking at, Mom? In the standard version, which precept uses do. Go ahead, Gina.
It is good for a man not to marry.
Is that in quotations?
No.
No, it's just
There
this.
is a colon.
Ah.
Now for the matters you wrote about, colon.
Uh-huh.
It is good for a man not to marry.
Okay. So,
What version you have?
yeah, what version is that?
I mean, I have no idea.
I love your honesty.
It says Holy Bible on it.
Right? But it's also good to know. We'll figure that one out for us. This is an important sentence, because it does start with him saying, you wrote me about this, and then it follows up with that statement.
The NIV Study Bible.
NIV statement. Okay, that's a good one too, right? We approve of NIV too. That ESV and the NASB that we generally use is a word-for-word translation. They take the word in the Greek and they find English. The NIV is a little more of a phrase by phrase. They're trying to make it a little more readable for us. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just how they did that translation. Okay, what's important about verse 1 to me and to a lot of the people where I read commentary is, it sounds like, and a lot of people read it as if what he is saying to them is, your question to me, church, was, you told me, is it good for a man to not touch a woman? Now, the presumption is, when is it right for a man to touch a woman? When he's married. So that's why I think they go ahead and make that translation, right? The presupposition is, sex is only within the bounds of marriage. This church would have known that. And so the question then becomes, is he stating back to them what they said to him? They wrote, Paul, hey,
Yes.
given that we live in Corinth, and what was sex like in Corinth?
It was a free-for-all.
Free-for-all.
Except for incest.
Except for incest, right, because we learned that two chapters ago. It was the one thing they couldn't tolerate, but everything else is fine. In fact, your religious act might have been sleeping with a prostitute, right? So, also in the Roman Empire, I had no idea how many Caesars and leaders of the Roman Empire are known to be bisexual, right? Yes. So many wives. Transgender was a norm. You know, like I don't want to get too graphic, but like some of the Caesars like took a little boy and made him look like a woman and married him. So there's some of that. So very, very free for all, very, very corrupt sexually. So now take this church that all of a sudden has their eyes opened to the fact that God only intends sex within the bounds of marriage, a man and a woman. And can you see how they're writing and going, well, Paul, should it be that maybe you shouldn't be having sex at all? Should we just like remove ourselves from that altogether? So a lot of commentaries, and I don't think they're off, write about the fact that this chapter is Paul's response to the church saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be married. Maybe we shouldn't get married. And if we are married, maybe we should stop. Or if we're married, maybe we should just not have sex. Because it's so corrupt out there. And if you're telling us that sex is only intended for a man and woman, maybe we'd be holier if we just never did it.
Yeah, because he addresses that a couple of sentences.
He does, right. Go ahead.
Is that like nuns and priests?
Yes, so also you need to know this chapter has been used throughout history to build entire groups of people. You know, I don't know if it is the only reason, but the Catholic Church, you know, traditionally a priest is not married. For a lot of the reasons Paul states in here. Yes, the Desert Fathers, the monks, there are sects of Christianity where they believe, you know, to truly be holy, to truly commune with God, then you need to also deny your sexual needs and impulses. Okay, so it could be this church is trying to overcorrect. And that's kind of interesting to keep in mind that this is the problem that Paul might be addressing. Now, not every commentary looks at this chapter this way, but a lot of them do. And I thought that was interesting, and it makes sense to my brain, but if it doesn't make sense to your brain, that's okay. We can still go through this verse by verse. Okay, now, so he says, here's the question you guys asked me about. Then in verse 2, he has a command. Right? His immediate response is, there's immoralities out there. They're living in the midst of it. You and I do too. And he says, because that exists, his first command is what? In verse 2, what does he say?
Each man should have his own.
Okay.
And each woman.
Yeah,
I love Paul. Own wife, and each woman have her own husband. You know why I love Paul? Because he equally addresses men and women in this chapter. You can tell, again, he knows the context of the city in which he's speaking. And so, a little different than Jesus' time, where when Jesus was speaking on marriage, it was always a man's choice, right? Only the man could divorce. And he's talking to a society where both men and women can divorce. And so it's a little bit different. I think you see that's why there's that being balanced. Okay, so what does immorality have to do with the fact that he immediately comes out and says that is his command? Does that fix everything? Sure helps, right? So it's kind of like he's saying this is a standard. Here's our starting point. If you want to have sex, then a man needs to have it with his wife, and a wife needs to have it with her husband, period. I think he's like, that's where we're starting from. This is the truth. Now, verse 3. I'm going to read verses 3 to 7, because he immediately goes to, I think, what he knows is a question of theirs. So verses 3 to 7. He says, let the husband fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. Okay, there's an exception to the man has sex with his wife, the wife has sex with her husband. There's one exception. What is it? What does he say? A time of prayer. Now, is this a command? Is he telling all couples, hey couples, you know what? Once a year, y'all need to stop having sex for a couple weeks and pray.
No, you have to agree.
You have to be, and it's not a command. He's calling it a. What's he calling it? It's not. He said a concession.
Concession.
What does concession mean? If you're conceding something, what are you doing? He's kind of like giving them something, right? I think this is where a lot of people get the idea that, again, was this church saying, hey, we're married, we're going to be super holy by never having sex. And so he's like, okay, the one reason I'll let you two married people not have sex is because you want to devote yourselves to prayer. That's his concession. He's like, I'm not commanding it, but if that's what you feel the need to do it for a short time. Because if they do it too long, what does he say? You're going to be tempted. Why are they going to be tempted? You have needs. And they're not dirty. And they're not wrong. They're God-given needs. So he says, and by the way, Satan is interested in like two things. A, he's interested in breaking up marriages by forcing them to go outside of marriage to get those needs met. And then B, he's trying to stop marriage by letting people fulfill that need without ever getting married, right? So he's interested in both those things. So he's like, so if you guys go too long, I want you to know they live in a very corrupt place. That don't put yourself in a place where you're going to meet some temptation. And he says, I like this. He says, end of verse 5, he says, and you guys have a lack of what? We in 2022 think we have a lot of self-control, don't we? I think it's easy for us to think we do, right?
I think we're almost told to get into it.
We are.
You need that.
And they too.
Medically and physically.
And they too, right? The Corinthian church was living in that too. Okay, so he says that's his command. It's an exception. It's for a time of prayer. And then we're going to hop down to verse 7. And Paul says something about himself. What does he say about himself in verse 7? What does he say?
I wish that all men were assigned.
Okay. Now, we read that, and you read a little, obviously you did your homework. What is his state? What is his marital state? He's single. So he's single. So the question becomes for a lot of people is how is it that Paul is single? Had he never been married? We don't know. Does the Bible tell us? No. Those of you that read commentaries, there's a lot of theories, right? There's a really prevalent theory that because he was high up in leadership in the Jewish church, that he would have had to have been married. If you were a Jew, it's almost looked upon as a sin if you're a man and you're not married by your early 20s. And so a lot of people say there's no way Paul could have become the leader in the Jewish faith if he was not married. Some people say he was a member of the Sanhedrin. The Bible doesn't explicitly say that, but there's a lot to make us think that he was part of the Sanhedrin. And if he was, he would have definitely been married. So if he was married, then you have to ask yourself, why is he now single? What are the options?
Or she maybe didn't accept
Ah.
his new faith.
That's a huge one. So that she didn't accept his new faith. That when Paul converted, right, to Christianity, when he met Jesus on the road, perhaps she left him. There's an interesting verse in Philippians 3, and it says that he suffered the loss of all things. Paul says of himself, suffered the loss of all things. So some people say, does that include perhaps his marriage? Because he talks about it in chapter 7, that sometimes if you come to faith and you're married but your spouse does not, to let them leave. Was he speaking from experience? Perhaps. The other option would be, did she die? That's the other one. So we don't know. We don't know what has happened, but we know that he sees his current state as being single as being a good one, right? Why does he think it's good that he's single? He says, verse 7, I wish all men were single, like me.
Because he can devote all of his time to God and to spread the word.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge part of it. When we get into, look at verse 34, 1 Corinthians 7:34. He's talking about being married and kind of the burden that it carries. 1 Corinthians 7:34, he's talking about one who is married. It says his interests are what? Divided. So for a married man, his interests are going to be, if he's a Christ follower, following Christ, but also keeping his wife happy, meeting her needs, sexually, economically, emotionally, right? All those. If he has kids, then he's got to take care of them. And so Paul is recognizing that if you are a single man, his interests don't have to be divided. It can be what pleases God, and I'm about that and that alone. Now, does he say it's a sin if you get married? He does not, right? Verse 7, it says, however, he says, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So what's he saying about singleness there? He's calling it a what from God? A gift. And marriage also, right? For some, singleness is their gift, and for some, being married is their gift. His point of view is to be single is amazing, right? He's enjoying it. His interests are not divided. There is an advantage to that. So, let's get up here. Let's get our couple thoughts up here that we just hit. We're going to make a messy chart. So he just addressed married couples, right? I'm going to say the assumption here is both are Christians. Right? And what did we just say? What's his command there? Did we just, as way of review, what's his command? Just summarize it. What does he say?
You only have relationships with each other.
Yes.
Sexual
Yeah.
relationships.
Okay, sex only in bounds of marriage. I also found it interesting that he say, husband and wives, your body is not your own. It's about the other person. It's not how can that other person fulfill me? It's how am I fulfilling him or her? That's countercultural in 2022. And it was back then too. Okay, so sex in the bounds of marriage and make each other very happy. The best you can, right? What's the other command about sex and marriage here? What is it? His concession is what?
Oh, for prayer, you can,
Only-
agreement
Only deprive on agreement
and
for prayer. And it's a concession. That's not a command. Okay. So those are the two things that he said to married couples. I think the assumption being that they're both Christians, and then he made the statement that to be single is good and it's an advantage, right? And that he wishes it for all people. The church doesn't say that. Churches don't say that. That's unfortunate. I mean, we don't say that often enough. So let's move forward. Let's look at 8 and 9, okay? He says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Okay, what's his next group he's addressing?
unmarried and widows.
Unmarried and widows. And again, I don't think I need to repeat this too much, but I'm going to make sure it's clear. Paul's assumption is what he's instructing them on is for the church. I don't think he assumes that he's speaking this truth for all of society. I think he wishes it was true for all of society, but this truth is really for the church. He didn't assume that he was changing all of Rome. He's saying, I'm talking to you as believers. Here's how you conduct yourself. So, what does he say to the unmarried and to the widows? What does he say? It has to do with sex again, right? What does he say?
You have no self-control.
If you have no self-control, then you need to get married. And let's start with the positive statement too in verse 8. He says what? This state is what?
It's great.
It's good.
And we don't hear that.
And that's what I'm saying.
In the church. It's all family, marriage and kids, and they probably need to be addressed.
Yes. For sure.
And I'm married.
Yeah. And like he said, it is good. It is good for them to remain even as I. It's not bad. It's not broken. It doesn't mean something's wrong with them. It doesn't mean they missed something. It doesn't mean their parents. I mean, I think we in the church, I'm with you, Janet. I think sometimes we look at single people and are like, well, something's wrong. You're just not in the right church. You haven't found the right person. And I don't read Paul doing that at all. He's affirming there is some good here. And there's an advantage. In fact, stay. However, when should you become married? What does he say?
We no longer have searches.
It is better to marry than to burn, right? There's that great little phrase.
Mine that adds with passion.
I like
It's
that.
mine, burn with passion.
Yeah. So if you fall in love with somebody, you need to marry.
Yes. I don't think that Paul is saying a reason to get married is you just can't keep your pants on. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying get married. I think he would say because you found the right person and you need to be joined with them, get married. Don't deny that because again, I think this is a church that's starting to get in the brain that if I deny my sexual impulses, I'm super holy. And he's saying, no, don't do that. Fulfill those needs. There's beauty in that, but there's also beauty in not, in remaining single as well.
And there's balance if you're going to fulfill that.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, it is better to marry than to burn. That is verse 8, and that is verse 9. Okay, I'm making sure I'm not missing anything. Let's look at verses 10 to 11, charging right along. Okay. But to the married, I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not send his wife away. Okay, verse 10 and 11. Who do these verses address? We're back to what column? Married, the first one. And I believe both Christians. Why? Because in a few verses, he's going to call out the cases where in a married couple, one's a Christian, one's not. So I think the presupposition here is they're both Christians. So he's saying to them, and he's saying it's not his words, he's saying whose words? These are God's words. How does he know God's words? How does Paul know God's words? How can he say, I'm not saying this, God is saying that. How can he say that? Huh? Yeah. And I think if you go back to Jesus' words as well. And again, he probably didn't hear them, but they've been probably passed on to him. But yes, both the law and Jesus' words. Okay, so he says, if you are married, both of you are Christians, what should not happen?
Divorce.
And I love that he starts with women. We're a room full of women today. I just love, some people say Paul hates women. I don't think so. It's interesting that he started that. He says his presupposition again would be that the woman could leave her husband. He says, don't. Parentheses, however, if she does or has already, then what does she need to do? Remain unmarried or, okay.
So you think he's giving these instructions to people that are even maybe a Christian wife married to an unchristian man?
No, she said this was both.
No, I think this is where both are Christians.
Okay, you think so?
Because he goes on to do the other situation.
I know it goes to further on, I didn't know whether it starts.
Well, it matches what he says, though, about if one's a Christian and one's not. Because he says, if the other wants to stay married, don't just leave them because they're not a Christian.
Right.
Right? So I think this is specifically in the assumption that both are Christians.
And he
So,
says, not I, but the Lord.
yes.
You're talking to people who aren't believers, they don't care what things.
Yeah, but-
True.
That's what it tells me. He's talking to people who doesn't care.
Right. That's a good point.
It is a good point. It is a good point that Paul here, again, he's speaking to the church. He doesn't expect all of the Roman Empire to line up with this, but he expects the church to line up with it, right? Because they have truth. They have the Holy Spirit within them. Okay, so his instructions here are to stay married. I think a bottom line for him is don't just divorce. Now, if you go back to Matthew 19, you want to look at it? Want to peek at it with me? I think you looked at it in your lesson. If you look at Matthew 19, and if you look at verses 1 to 12, if you want, I also want to say this. I don't think Paul believes he's giving a theology of marriage. I don't think Paul believes that he's telling them everything to know about what it means to be a Christian and married. I think he's addressing very specific questions they have about marriage and divorce. Okay? Jesus gives us a theology of marriage here in Matthew 19. Paul does a better job in Ephesians of giving a theology of marriage, what it means to be married, what about the roles in a marriage. I think he's talking about very specific. So, you know, we also have to be careful about and I think again, some churches historically have taken 1 Corinthians 7 and like built a theology on it. I don't think that was the intent. He's answering questions. But here's the theology of marriage, because it's Jesus, right? Matthew 19, verse 1 says, when Jesus finished words, he departed from Galilee. He went to Judea. Great multitudes followed him. He healed them. Pharisees came to him, testing him. They know the law, right? So they come up to Jesus and say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all? For Jews at that time, it was. If you just didn't like your current model of wife, and back then, also know this too, marriages were usually arranged. It wasn't because they fell in love, right, and went on a lot of dates. It was because the two families said, you two are now married. And so the reigning thought was, if you just don't like her, if she didn't make dinner, she burned your dinner, you don't like how she acts, whatnot, then just put her away. Like, they wrote into the law, how do you do that? So they come to Jesus. They're like testing him. They're going to catch him. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Verse 4, Jesus says, haven't you read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Verse 7, they said, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said, because of what? Your hardness of heart. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it was not intended, right? I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality. What's immorality again? Sex outside of marriage. If your wife went outside your marriage and she had sex with another man, then you are permitted to divorce him. Just like if my husband chooses to go have an affair with another person, I think the Bible makes it clear I have the right, if it comes to that, to divorce him. So Jesus acknowledges there are situations where divorce is allowed. He commits adultery. Okay, so verse 10, the disciple said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like that, it's better not to marry. And he says, not all men can accept that statement, but only those to whom it has been given. And obviously Paul had accepted that. So, both women and men, going back to 1 Corinthians 7, instructions for divorce. So again, there are situations where divorce is permitted. That would be adultery. I would add abuse, right? I would add that if you find yourself married to a man that is not of the same faith as you are, and he says, I gotta leave, you let him go, right? There are situations where it's allowed. But if that happens, Paul says what? What should you do? Remain unmarried, or seek to be reconciled. And that's the hard part, isn't it? But we're going to leave it there for now. We're going to move forward, right? Because we're going to get all of Paul's thoughts under our belt, and then we will come back to it. So, verses 12 to 16. Let's look at these. But to the rest I say, and so you have to go, who's the rest? The rest are married couples where they're unequally yoked. Can I say that? That's very church-ease, but it's an easy way to say it. But to the rest I say, not the Lord. That I say, not the Lord. So he says, I'm deducing this. Again, I think he's saying that because he says, I have the Spirit within me. I have been taught. I know the law, so I feel pretty confident to say that this is where it goes, right? So, verse 12, the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who has an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, let her not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Where am I stopping? 16. For how do you know a wife whether you will save your husband, or how do you know a husband whether you will save your wife? Okay, so we have a new column, right? It's married couples one is an unbeliever. Okay, let's do a little bit of review. How would this be the case in this church?
Only one of them was converted.
Right. So again, this was a baby church. Probably many of them came to Christ as adults. Could be the case also if they were Jews, right? Maybe one came to believe in Jesus and the other did not. A lot of Gentiles, again, maybe only one of them is willing to leave idolatry and follow Christ and the other is not. It's a special situation. Again, going back to 7 verse 1, they have questions. I can imagine in this church, the believing spouse is probably thinking in their brain, well, I'm being defiled if I remain married to this unbeliever. And if I want to be holy, I actually need to leave this relationship so I'm not defiled by my unbelieving husband. That's probably some of the thinking that's going on. And Paul blows their mind because he says what? What does he say? Stay married if. What's the if? Stay married if what?
If he or she consents to live.
If unbeliever, right. If unbeliever consents, stay married.
Because we're assuming that, since this is a young church, probably at the time most of them married, they were both unbelievers.
Yes, probably yes. Absolutely. Actually, we can almost say 100%, right? Yeah.
That's what I would
It's a
say. They
baby
were all
church.
unbelievers, now
Right.
one, which is different than
Mhm.
today, should a believer marry an unbeliever?
Right. So today, particularly if a child has been raised, in, I will use my Anna Clara, right? She's sitting right here. She's easy. So she's been raised in the church, you know, and it is different than if she chose, when she decided to get married, to marry an unbeliever. John and I would have been highly upset. We can't stop her if she's an adult, right? So that is a little bit different. However, I think this rule could still apply, right? So even if that happens, you know, and the believing spouse goes, whoa, did I do something wrong? Paul's advice still follows, right? If the unbeliever wants to stay married, stay married. Okay, let's get the other side. What if the unbeliever wants to leave? If unbeliever wants to leave, what do you do?
Let them leave.
Okay, why? I think there's a reason why. I think he states it. It's kind of a goal. And I think it follows God's heart too. Where is it? Verse 15, the last phrase of verse 15. Look at it. I think that's the why. God has called us to live in peace. I think Paul's saying, let them go. Don't fight. It's not the reason to fight and have World War III in your house every day. Let them go. Will it break your heart? Probably, right? But let them go because God values peace. Now, let's go back and go, okay, so why stay with an unbeliever? For this church, like I said, this might have shook them because they might have said staying married to an unbeliever means I'm being exposed to non-Christian things. I might be getting defiled. But Paul says you need to remember something. And what is that?
You have an influence on the other person.
You have an influence. It's a really interesting way to state it, and I'm still battling with it.
You should have an influence.
Well, right. So, verse 14, my version, the NASB, which is the one we study in Precepts, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. Is it saying that the unbelieving husband, like, becomes saved because?
No.
We know that doesn't make sense, right? So, what is it saying?
Well, what logic?
Is what? Yeah.
I mean, logic is to become one flesh and study that last week.
Mhm.
And if the unbelieving spouse is wanting to stay, then they obviously are committed to covenant, which is something that is, you know, of God. And so I would say that they are seeking salvation, and this is saying sanctification or salvation can come through sanctification.
Yes.
Like,
Okay.
that's the hope.
I'm following you there. Somewhere I wrote. Hold on. Go ahead. Go ahead,
Allowing
Wendy.
themselves to still be set apart from culture by state.
Yes. Okay. So that word sanctify right? We use it for Christians. We say, I'm sanctified as a Christian when I come to faith in Jesus Christ, and then God calls me away from my past life and more to him, and I'm sanctified. That word sanctified here, it simply means to render venerable or hallowed, to separate from profane. So, like you said, that unbelieving husband, because they are joined to a believer who should have the Holy Spirit, should be living differently, they are being exposed to the things of Christ, right? That they are perhaps being wooed to Christ, being drawn to him because of the presence of that Christian in their household.
And he says both of the scenarios, he's saying he hopes to have the same outcome.
Yes.
The one that leaves and the one that stays.
Yes.
But I also think, especially for these people, and even for us, that if you can't become a Christian and your partner does not, whether before or after you.
Right.
That does not say that you're totally bad because you're staying with that person who is not a Christian. And I think maybe that was heavy on these people's minds, that if I'm staying with this Christian and living with him as his wife, everybody's going to think I am too.
Right.
And I must be. Because, wow.
We've seen some of that in modern Christian times as well. Like if someone we know is a Christian but their spouse is not, do we look down on them? Do we think differently of them? Now, it is true, they have a different battle, right? Their interests, to use the phrase in verse 34, are probably divided. That's going to be a hard road for them to move down, right? Because they're going to have to ask questions, how do I honor Christ and honor my unbelieving spouse? That's not easy at all. You probably, everyone in this room can think of somebody that's walked that very hard road. And yes, Paul's heart in all of this, he has the heart of an evangelist, as we all should, which is his hope and his prayer would be that the unsaved believer comes to Christ as a result of that union with the believer. And he also mentions the children, right?
Yes.
What does he say about the kids in verse 14? There's an advantage for the children. What should the advantage of the children be?
Talks about being unclean, but
They're not unclean. They can be
they can be
holy. They be holy.
Because there's one individual in there that is a believer, and
Yeah.
they will be believers and come to know Christ.
So, again, interesting. I don't want to dive too deep in commentaries, but there's some interesting thought on, what does it mean for children who are below the age of, what do we call it, when they can be held accountability. That, if children are being raised in a Christian home and they are too young to make that decision for themselves, by virtue of being in a Christian home, are they saved? Is that what this verse is saying? I don't think you should read too much into it. I think you simply go, there's definitely an advantage for children when they are raised in a home where both are Christians, and there is also an advantage if just one is, right? Because again, they're being exposed to the things of Christ, the things of the Spirit. They're being shown how to live a different life. Okay, so he addresses that very, very sticky situation. Verse 16, he asks a question. How do you know, O wife, whether you will save your unbelieving husband? Can she know? Can she know? No.
It's just like
Yes.
it's just like trying to woo anyone out.
Right.
It's just that it's your husband.
Yeah.
You're living the gospel.
Yes.
That's all you can do.
There's no guarantee, but who does know? Who knows? God knows, right? It is a hard walk of faith for that wife or that husband of an unbelieving spouse. It is a hard walk of faith, but he wants them to remember that the possibility of them turning to Christ should theoretically increase by that person's influence. It's hard, but he asked that question. So what he's saying is, and I think the tendency in this church would have been for them to just leave. I think he's talking to a church where they would have been like, oh, I'm married to a believer, I need to leave them. And he's saying, no, you need to stay, because good things could come from the kingdom if you stay. I think that's what he's leading toward.
Think about this, and that this is actually a missionary. Paul's a missionary and other people. You go into an area and start witnessing. You're not saving husband and wife at one time. You probably are saving interested in one or the other. And if they would go, oh, I'm not a leader now, well, what's that gonna do?
Right, what does it do for the church?
You may have influence to save your partner someday.
Okay, let's hold right here. Up to now, we're at verse 16. Applications, thoughts for churches today. How are we doing as a church today with these things, or what should we be doing? Like, what's rumbling around in your brain? Stopping for a moment before we go further.
Well, our society does not respect the covenantal bond between married couples, nor do they respect the significance of being married or getting married. We are a quick society that says, oh, I like you, all right, now I'm tired of you, you gotta go. I mean, we just are a instant gratification situation. So the sex is that instant gratification, and we don't respect our bodies. That's apparent by how we dress. I just think that today we are not at all living, breathing, or thinking about this.
Right, so our larger society is not. So what does it mean then for our church to be dropped down in the middle of that? Or to exist in the middle of it? Again, I can't, you're right, Leslie, I don't disagree with the words you said. I can't force the world outside my church doors or my home to live like this. So what does it mean for us as a church to exist in that?
We have prayed repeatedly over the 40 years for those whose spouse is not a Christian. We have prayed over the years, over and over, for either that wife or that husband, for the Christian and for the non-Christian.
So you, knowing couples going through that, have offered prayers.
We have prayed, and sometimes they were answered positively, and sometimes they were not. We're there.
I've seen both too.
But we have prayed a lot for the one who comes to Sunday school and the one, of course, they want to step foot in the church.
I say there's a major failure in the talking about marriage and sex and being single in the church. Like, Ian and I did the youth group for a couple months, and there's a huge, just like, we don't talk about it. And youth pastors will sort of do maybe a 2 or 3 week study on relationships, but there is no real education or talking about what being married means, what sex means, what it's good for, what you're not supposed to do with it, those kinds of things. So to me, as a young person, and I think back about growing up in church, I got most of my education about any of this from my parents and from my examples that I saw growing up, but the church failed to teach me in big ways all of this.
Yeah, I mean, come on, look at the proposals and the propositions that are on the table currently right now in reference to gays, lesbians, transgender. I mean, let's put it out there. It needs to be put on the table. But think about that. Think about that proposition that's just passed in Florida. And so they won't even allow the school systems to talk about certain things. But as a church, we have failed our youth, our young people in understanding about.
People who are confused. I mean,
they're so confused. They really are. They're so confused.
What's happening? What's on TV?
Right.
Right.
Oh, that's bad.
So I would say again, I think what I'm hearing is if the world, if their sexual ethics and ethics of relationship are broken as it was in Corinth, then us inside the church walls have a heavy responsibility to combat that openly and consistently and regularly.
Yes.
And it feels like we don't, and so we have to ask ourselves, why don't we? Is it because we don't understand?
Well, but he wasn't really, yes. But if we go back to what we're studying in Corinthians, and specifically this, what he's really saying is your marriage will be a representation, if you live it well, of who I am. And so sometimes that's all that we can do, or all that we have control over, are the relationships in our lives.
Right.
And how we live those and how they reflect and glorify.
Right, and so you are absolutely 100% right. All we as a church have control over is the marriages represented or the singles represented in our body and all those histories, right?
That's what we talked about last week.
Right, but we have to be clear about how you support them and shape them and share truth with them. Because you're absolutely right. I read somewhere a really cool statement to what you just said and made me think about. Both being single and being married is a reflection of God. Because if you're married, you're a reflection of God, Jesus and his church. If you are single, I can't remember the exact words, I'll have to look it up. You are a reflection, I have to find it, I'll look for my notes in just a second. It was actually a really great statement. But yeah, we have to be intentional about the relationships in our own body and supporting them. I like what you said, praying for the ones where it's difficult. To your point, Anna Claire, are we really clear with our children, our youth, our young adults? Lindy.
I just think Paul's example here is kind of wrestling with something. You know, they came to the Lord, they decided everything's going to be super black and white, and so we're not going to have any sex or whatever it was they decided. They asked, and he was willing to kind of wrestle with it. It bothers me when this is considered a chapter on marriage, because it's not.
Right.
There are some others that are very clearly at, but he's kind of wrestling with this, and I'm thinking, Anne Claire, I'm sorry. Ouch. Well, but here's the deal, we need, as a church, we need to prepare parents to deal with this in their home. And in the absence of that, the church needs to be there. Because a lot of, this law recently in Florida, they're just saying, leave it to the parents to talk about it. Well, how many parents actually are?
And
Right. Very few are equipped.
But like
and
you're
that's what I'm
saying,
saying here in the church.
The churches. That can trickle to the churches and be a mandate to the churches, then, in my opinion, just like you do with charity, and when you talk about taxes and the way that we think about that, you know what I mean? It's like it should be a mandate to the churches to help in the communities and help the families that they're serving.
Because the churches are more effective than schools are.
That's what the government is
Yeah.
saying.
Every day.
And I think we need to not only be more intentional with our kids, but also just with adults about what is being said in your home.
But I think in right now, even in a room like this, we've got to really prayerfully consider how to talk about it. There's a lot to talk about, but how are we presenting it in such a way that we're not going, sinners,
We're not these people that
calm
wrote the
down,
law.
let's talk about some general
Well,
stuff.
I don't think
that's
that the point is not that, because it's exactly what Paul's saying. My mom says all the time, you can't expect non-believers to act like Christians. You can't expect that. So the reality is you're not, when you provide education for youth or parents, you're not saying you're evil, you're horrible. It's, let me help you figure out how to talk about this with your kids.
And I think that's,
Word is what.
and I said it to Rachel, she and I chatted a little bit yesterday, and I was like, I actually find a chapter like this, when you give it the time, and to your point, Lindy, it's not a theology of marriage. What is it? It's a man helping a church wrestle through very real issues and some points of where they're maybe confused. And I see a lot of hope and grace and mercy. He's like, this is good, this is better, but if you find yourself here, you're not beyond hope. I mean, he says that, right? It's great to be single, but if you find yourself married, awesome. It's not a sin. It's great to be, it's hard to be married to an unbeliever, and if he leaves you, you shouldn't feel condemned for it, right? I mean, there's a lot more hope and grace, but how open is he here? And we go, how often have we just in the last year in this place openly spoken on these things?
We have.
We have. I think we're very afraid of offending and putting people out, yes. And
That's the problem.
it is a place where people can feel very easily offended and isolated and hurt, and so we need to be full of grace and mercy and honest about our own. I mean, I do not have a perfect marriage, I don't know how many of you all do, but we have to be honest about our own struggles.
Well, and it also can't be, we can't expect every family to address it
Right.
So better to equip the families with the gospel and tools of how to grow, because, you know, Gina, I mean, she's going to talk about it differently than I am, and that's okay. Our family is unique, you know?
Right.
And it's fine.
Right. But it's all based in grace and truth.
And gospel.
Right. Right. Okay, let's keep moving forward. We're gonna chat again. I wanted us to stop and take our temperature for a moment there. We're all doing well. We're all doing well. No one's left the room yet, so we're good. Okay, let's move forward. Let's look at 17. Right? Okay, we looked at these situations. Now we've got more situations. Okay, 17. 17 to 24. I think we're going to don't get in the weeds in this. These verses aren't about circumcision and slavery, okay? There's a strong truth that we need to glean, and he's taking a moment. And so 17 to 24, here we go. He says, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. Let's stop. If you were married, why are you married? According to that verse. If you're married right now, why are you married according to that verse? 17. God called you. God assigned it to you. If you are widowed, if you are divorced, if you are single, if you are married to an unbeliever, why are you there according to verse 17? God put you there. We have got to get, it's not because you're broken. God knows you're there. He's assigned you there. He's put you there. Yes, there's some confusion about, well, what if I did something wrong? That's when God's mercy blows my mind. But I read in that, God knows where you are in your life right now, where you're at in your story. If you're following him, he's called you, he's assigned you there. And according to verse 17, Paul says, walk like what? Walk in that manner. Wherever you find yourself, walk it out in faith with the Holy Spirit. He says, I direct that in all the churches. That's his bottom line. Now, let's read. He's going to go ahead and share how he thinks through it. Was a man called already circumcised? Those are the Jews, right? He says, let him not become uncircumcised. Hold on a minute. Can you undo that? I think it's Paul being silly. I think he's being facetious here, and he knows the church is going to be like, that's impossible. He's like, that's the point. If you were called as a Jew, you can't undo your Jewness, right? That's who you are. Okay. Has anyone been called in circumcision, you Gentiles? Don't go get circumcised. And all the men said, thank you. 19. Circumcision is what? And uncircumcision is? But what matters, according to verse 19? Keeping the commandments of God. Whether you're married, single, divorced, widowed, any of those things. What matters is keeping the commandments of God. I think you can apply that. Let each man, he's going to say it again, let each man remain in that condition in which he was called. What were you called while a slave? Don't worry about it. But if you are able to become free, that's awesome, do it. I added that, that's awesome. 22, for he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. I love how he plays with language. Verse 23, you're bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, again, for the third or fourth time, let each man remain with God in that condition in which he was called. So for all of these people, the bottom line truth is what? What's side? Yes. Stay as you are. Now, I love it. He says that, but also there's howevers. If your unbelieving husband wants to leave, if you're burning with desire and you find the man of your dreams, go ahead and get married. But generally speaking, you don't. I think he's addressing the other side. I think he's addressing people that say, okay, now I'm a Christian. I've got to change all of these things. And I think he's making the point that God loves and can use you as you are if you're seeking to follow his commands. And I think,
trying to get the men to be circumcised.
well, and I don't know, but I think this is a church that's like, hey, I'm a Christian now, I should make myself uber holy. So it means I need to get rid of this person and this person in my life, and I need to change things. And he's saying, no. Are you following God's commands in the situation in which you are? If the answer is yes, that's what God wants. Stay the course. Why? Because you don't know the impacts you can make, right? He went back there to no marriage. Okay, That's 17 to 24. I love that we can nutshell that really easily, but I think that's where he's going with that. Okay, 25. Let's move. Now we have a new column to start on our chart. Whew. Now concerning virgins, if there are any. I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. Now, 25. A couple of you have other versions. Now concerning virgins. Do you have virgins in your versions? Virgins in your version, huh? Betrothed. Okay, so some people say that that what he's really referring to are those, remember in the Jewish system and obviously in the Roman system, marriages were arranged, and this would be specifically maybe a girl, but some versions take it to also include the men, who the families have said, okay, you're saved and you're going to marry this person. So, because again, the presupposition is if you're not married, you're a virgin. If only that were always true, it's not, but that's kind of where he's coming from, just so you know, a little bit of context there. Okay, he says, now concerning virgins, I have no commands of the Lord. God didn't speak directly to this, but he says, I do give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. He's been following him, he sought him, and so he says, here's what I believe. I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Stay as you are. We just wrote that. Are you bound to a wife? If you're engaged, if you're married, don't seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Don't seek a wife. But if you should marry, you have not, what does he say? Sinned. You've not sinned. And if a virgin should marry, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm just trying to spare you. I love that. 29. But this I say, brother, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. For the form of this world is passing by, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about whose things? Things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Amen. His interests are divided. And the woman who is unmarried and the virgin, two different groups there, right, is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and spirit. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is seemly and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Okay, let's hit that last phrase, because you're hearing Paul's heart. What is Paul trying to accomplish in the church? That very last phrase. What is he trying to, what does it say? Undistracted devotion to the Lord. I think we need to add that up here. Like, that's his heart. Why? Why is he concerned about undistracted devotion to the Lord?
Because he is zealous for the gospel.
Yes, and should we be?
Yeah, and I think he understands that the capacity that person has is really great.
And he says something about the times that they're living in. Did you catch that? Where was that? That was back in verse 26 and verse 29. He's very aware of where he is sitting in history. What does he think about where he's at in history? It's stressful, right? Verse 26, it's good in view of the present distress. What might that be? If you're in the church in Corinth, if you're in a church in the United States of America, what's your present distress? Are we distressed?
It's the culture and the outside world.
That we are bumping up against the culture, and that outside world wants us to shut up. Don't meddle. We don't want your truth. And in different ways and forms, back in Rome, and Nero's coming. There's times in which, if you're a Christian, you're going to lose your life. In the United States of America, we ask ourselves, are they going to take away our tax exempt status? Are they going to make it hard for us to meet? So there's present distress. Paul realizes there's present distress, and the other thing that he says is, verse 29, the time has been, I don't know what that means exactly, but I think he's referring to Jesus is coming back soon.
I think that.
Yeah. So he says, if Jesus is coming back soon and times are hard and the gospel needs to go out there, okay, those are his two things. And then we go to verse 35. He says, I want to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Then we start our new little section of the chart, and this is to virgins. I'm going to go ahead and call them the unmarried. These are people that have not yet been married at all. I mean, he talks about widows, people that have been married and their spouses died. He makes some reference to people that have been married and divorced. I think this is for those who have never been married. Okay, what is his command about them? What does he have to say? He says it's good to remain what? Bottom line. It matches this right here.
Stay as you are.
Right.
Say I'm married.
Right. Why is Paul saying that? He's trying to get undistracted devotion to the Lord. And he's like, the times are short, there's distress. It's hard to be married and follow God. Not the easiest thing to do. So if you can, it's good to stay as, as you are. However, if you're betrothed to someone and you've agreed that you're going to get married, then is it a sin to get married? No. Do it. Right? If you find yourself unmarried for any reason, it's good to remain as you are. He affirms that. Why? For all of those reasons. The present distress. Let's go to verse 32. I also like verse 32. Paul says, you also hear his heart. This is Paul speaking. He wants you to be free from what? Okay, married people are in the room. What are we concerned about? Ooh, we're all women today. What are we concerned about? He says it.
Kids and the family and bills and food and keeping everybody clean, taking care of everybody, just goes on. And the list
Right.
goes on.
The list goes on. Yeah, if I do this thing, is it going to make John upset? When John comes home from out of town, he's going to be tired. Is he going to want to go do things? Am I going to make him happy if I make this choice or that choice? And layer that with, I'm a follower of Christ. I want to obey him more than anything. And sometimes making John Beckman happy and making Jesus happy, it doesn't always align. Does anyone else feel me on that? Right. Okay, so he says, Paul says, what I'm really after is I want you to be free from that concern. And to be free from that concern is if you are married or virgin, just stay as you are. Right? He says that in here. Interesting. Okay. And he says about the men, his interests are divided. The woman who's unmarried, the virgin, is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and spirit. Like she can focus in on that, or he can focus in on that, and make that the sole call of their life. Like I said, the Catholic Church and some churches and denominations took this verse and said, okay, let's create a whole sect and move them out to the desert and far, far away, and, they can't, where the women don't ever interact with the men, right? And we're going to, because that makes you holier. I don't think that's what Paul's saying. I don't think that's what he's after, because he says if you need to get married, do it. But anyways, that's where it goes. Okay. 35. Paul says, I say this for whose benefit? Not to put a restraint on you. I read that as he's like, I'm not being realistic here. He's not about, I like what you said, Mindy, this isn't a theology of marriage, right? These aren't rules. He's like, I'm not putting a restraint. I'm not giving you laws to follow. You don't need to sit in a committee and try to come up with, like, the rules. He's like, that's not his heart. His heart is, thank you. Not to put a restraint upon it, but to promote what is seemly, to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Okay. Any questions on those before we move forward? Okay, good stuff. Let's finish out the chapter 36 to 38. Right? Here we go. Whew. If any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, If she should be of full age, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry. So he can see the daddies in the room starting to sweat. You know, I've already started talking to his family about my daughter marrying them. Is that right? Is that wrong? Am I going to make her unholy? Like, and so Paul's saying, listen, if you've already made that decision, you're not sinning, let her marry. Verse 37, but he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his own will, and has decided this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then both he who gives his virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. But go back to verse 37. How should that decision be made? So your man and your daughter is of marrying age, and you're asking yourself, should I let her get married? Verse 37, I think, is a neat little checklist for how do you make that decision. What does he say in verse 37? You have to stand firm where? In your own heart. What else does it say? Being under no... What does that mean? If the man feels like he's being forced from outside forces, if he's going, wow, what's the church going to think of me? Are they going to make fun of me? Is it going to make this person happy if I do it? He's like, if you in your own heart are clear on your decision, if you don't feel forced from the outside world, if you feel like you can make your own decision and you've decided that your daughter should not get married, good decision. But if all those conditions are still present and you've decided she needs to get married, good too. Just know that to be married makes life a little harder. That's what I think he wants him to believe. I think that's what he wants him to know. When you make that decision, it's an informed decision. And marriage doesn't necessarily make life easier as a believer, it complicates it. Okay, what? Yes, the ESV changes it. Tell us a little
We are
bit.
talking about somebody who has a daughter that they have betrothed to be married
Yes.
to God.
Yes,
Should you force them or even let them to go marry
right.
this other guy? I guess who's maybe a sinner, not a Christian.
Doesn't say.
You've got to do what you determine in your heart is the best thing to do.
Yeah, that's what he said. I think the specific situation is a man in the church who
Or
said,
if
your daughter.
you are betrothed, should you get married?
Yes.
Yeah, betrothal's a different, like, they're just single and deciding to get married. They're betrothed. I don't know what all that meant to them lawfully and things like that, because usually weren't you betrothed for years, promised that this is.
Yeah, Mary was betrothed to Joseph, so we have that example, right? Which meant that that decision had been made and set in stone, and it was as binding as a marriage.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's still true in Corinth. It sounds like it might be.
So it says, so then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better.
Right.
So it goes for either or.
Yeah. So the key in both interpretations, whatever the situation is, I think the key lies in verse 37, is how do you make that decision? Are you firm in your heart? Are you free from outside influences? Are you making the decision? You have freedom in Christ, right? You have your own will, and you decide in your own heart what to do. Go with it. That's why I said I read this chapter less about condemnation and rule following and who's bad and who's good, as much about mercy and grace and empowering people to make decisions based on their heart and following Christ. Not based on what society or people in the church expect, but their relationship with Christ. That's what I see going on a lot. Okay, 39 to 40. Let's finish it. 7 minutes. Okay, here we go. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives. What does that mean? We already said it here. If you are a Christian, according to Paul back then, and you've been divorced just because you didn't like how your husband acted, we're leaving out abuse and adultery and that if your spouse was an unbeliever. But if you just up and left your marriage, right, according to verse 39, he's saying you're bound. You need to walk through life as if you are still bound to that person. I think that's what he's saying there. He says, but if your husband is what? Dies. What then? Verse 39. You're free to marry. Who?
A Christian.
Only in the Lord.
Uh-huh.
Marry a Christian. Marry a Christian. And so verse 40. But in my opinion, I like Paul, because he's single.
Single.
Yeah, he's living his best life. He's an evangelist. God's call is easier on him, right? He doesn't have a wife at home going, Paul, when are you coming home? How am I going to feed the kids? Right? He doesn't answer to anybody but God alone, and he loves that life. He says, in my opinion, she's happier if she remains as is. And I think, I love it, I think I have what?
Spirit of God.
Whoa. Okay, wait, we got to get that up here. That's our last little thing. Widows, what? They have some freedom, right? Freedom to what? Freedom to marry.
Or not.
Yeah. A believer or not.
Or stay single.
I think all these people stay single.
Yes.
If you find yourself single, again, I really think, and I agree with a lot of the commentaries that write and say, this is a church that was leaning toward, because I am a Christian, I am holier if I either stay married and never have sex or leave my husband. And he's like, there is good in being single, but stay as you are and follow God in whatever situation you are at. And this is good. So, based on this study, how can our church reflect the truths of this to our body? Again, I don't think we can change society out there. The only way we change society out there is if we live in whatever relationship we find ourselves in, whatever station we find ourselves in life. If we live that fully as to the Lord, then we can affect change out there, right? But we can't try to affect change out there without working here, first and foremost. So, how do we reflect these truths, and we got 5 minutes, in our own church body? How do we do that?
The examples of the people in the church that are single, or whether they're married or not.
Right.
If you're not doing and setting the examples yourself, then you cannot teach it to the rest of the church, or expect for the people to believe you outside the church.
Yeah.
So if you're here in the church and you've divorced not once but twice,
Yeah.
or you've had extramarital affairs within the church, with someone else within the church, then the church is no better than the outside.
You have to
You're
live
not
different. You have to
not
different.
setting the example. You're not walking the walk. You can talk the talk, but are you walking the walk?
How do we do that? How do we equip our church to walk the
I was
walk?
gonna say, it's kind of like, what Anna was saying about talking about sex. I think you also have to talk about and celebrate the uniqueness of what it looks like to be single and to live the gospel, and why you can do that in a way that is exciting and good, but also balance that and not isolate people who are married and talk about the benefit and what it looks like to be married and to live that gospel too. So I think we just don't talk about it, and then churches create these ministries that are like for singles, or which are probably good things, but it's like everyone's goal is the same. It's just gonna look different.
Everyone's goal should be this.
Yes.
And staying as you are and reflecting God's goodness wherever it is.
This is the first time I've ever heard this presented in church, in a church atmosphere. I mean, I've never studied this.
The parts that I have heard are about divorced people and how, if you divorce and you remarry, then you're wrong. And you can't serve in the church. And that's not what this chapter is saying or focused on, right? It's like wherever you are at, however it came to be, like follow God now and let him work in it. John and I, you probably heard me talk, teach emotionally healthy spirituality. Pete Scazzaro has a church in is it Brooklyn? Maybe Brooklyn, New York. Anyways, I love what he says about healthy churches celebrate singleness. They have radically, that there's like a radical to singleness. And when I read that, I was like, no church that I've ever grown up does that. Affirms that situation not as like a temporary station in life, but as a full and a complete station in life that enables you to do some different things than one who is married. I think we missed the boat on that. Because, yeah, I've already said that once, but yes, I think to all of this, it does start with how you live in your family first. And then it goes then in your church, and then outside the doors. Any other thoughts, questions,
Well, I
concerns?
just feel like
Go
we
ahead.
also need to understand why marriage and affirm that.
Yes.
I know young people are under a lot of pressure, but what's the point? One of our sons-in-law was just ravished by his friends because he married and had to really make a decision about his friendships, so there's that comes out there too.
What do they say? Like the age for people to get married is getting really close to 30 now. Not bad. I mean, not bad either. I mean,
But what are they doing before that?
Right.
There's a lot of married people that are living with, well, the wedding's too costly, we can't afford it. What?
I actually read a really interesting article recently that said, I don't think it was an article written to Christians, but it was a university that did a study on groups of people that are married. And it's people, the highest success rate was people that got married early 20s and never lived with their spouse.
Wow.
Highest success rate.
Wow.
And so, so there are truths that we know that are we celebrating? You're right. Like why do you choose to get married? Why choose to stay single? And if someone that was single suddenly falls in love, like celebrate that, right? We're not about condemning one another. We're about empowering people to live wherever they're at in the power of Christ in a way that affects change in the world. That's what Paul was after. So, any other thoughts? Good, I got your brains all thinking, right?
Yeah.
Go out there now and change your family and change the world too. If only it was that simple. So, take a break. And look at that, it's only 11:02. We got through that. See, we only handled one chapter a week.